It is a money-making scheme that makes Trump stakes look like small potatoes. Brand new reporting revealing that the ex-president funneled more than $100 million that he raised off of the big lie, a toxin injected by Trump and his allies into the political bloodstream of our very own democracy, right into his pile of legal bills. The New York Times reporting this, that, quote, Mr. Trump has averaged more than $90,000 a day in legal-related costs for more than 3 years, none of it paid with his own money. And much of those funds come from the very same thing that has landed Trump in legal trouble in the first place. $254 million raised in the post-election period when Trump regularly lied to his supporters, claiming that the election was rigged against him, and tried desperately to overturn his election defeat. As the New York Times reports, even though Trump called on his supporters to fill up a so-called election defense fund, just a fraction of the money he raised from his supporters, $15.6 million, actually went toward any of the lawsuits or recounts, all of which, of course, failed to turn up any fraud or move the needle in Trump's favor, because, as we all know, there was no fraud on a scale that would have impacted the election result at all, anywhere. Instead, all those contributions went to a political action committee, the Save America PAC, and after Trump left the White House, another PAC, the MAGA PAC, began to take in these donations, all of it, to pay Trump's legal bills, which were soaring as prosecutors zeroed in on Trump's alleged criminal conduct. As the investigations led to 4 historic indictments, Trump spent nearly $60 million in legal fees in 2023. All while scrambling to find ways to get his supporters to continue to foot the bill for his legal fees. New York Times reports this. Early last year, Trump made a change to bring more money into Save America, the PAC that was paying his legal expenses. At first, 1 cent of every dollar he raised online went to Save America, and the rest went to his 2024 campaign. But with Save America short of cash to pay lawyers, he increased that to 10%. Now Trump is stuck in a dilemma of his own making. The needs of his presidential campaign are in danger of being overshadowed by the need to pay his lawyers, who essentially have one strategy in mind. They want to prevent any of the cases from going to trial before the November election, which, of course, Trump is telling his own voters he needs to win in order to have the charges against him dismissed or suspended indefinitely. New York Times reports that under Trump's current arrangement with the RNC, donations go to the PAC, paying his legal bills, before a penny goes to the Republican Party. It seems like he needs every penny he can get. From the Times again, quote, the account paying Trump's legal bills will most likely be out of money by summer. At the current spending pace, then Trump will have to decide whose money is he going to use to pay his lawyers. The next chapter, with the January 6th Select Committee coined the big ripoff, is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. National investigative reporter for the Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, is here. Plus, former RNC spokesman and host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller, is here. With us at the table, senior executive editor at Bloomberg Opinion and MSNBC political analyst Tim O'Brien's here, and Democratic strategist and director of the public policy program at Hunter College, Basil Smikle, was here. Carol Leonnig, Chris Christie made this one of the central pillars of his primary candidacy against Donald Trump. Let me play some of Christie trying to make this argument against Trump before Republican primary voters.
When you look at just his campaign filings yesterday, almost most of the money that middle-class Americans have given to him, he spent on his own legal fees. I mean, this guy's a billionaire. And how about we go down the street, maybe just sells Trump Tower and pays for his legal fees that way, or maybe sell the plane.
He's the cheapest person I've ever met in my life. And what he's very good at, Caitlin, is spending other people's money. Those supporters, write a check to Trump for president. They think they're paying for campaign expenses, not for personal legal expenses. What happened to him, let's say with the documents case, had nothing to do with a campaign at all. It's a personal fault of his, mistakes he made, that he's now being held to account for and has to pay lawyers to defend him.
So, Carol, we match, as you can see. This message only lasted and only was in front of Republican primary voters as long as Chris Christie's candidacy lasted. And now that it's over, I haven't heard the Biden camp make this argument. But my question for you, and this is what I see as one of the big hallmark differences between 16 and 24. In 16, and we, like a lot of networks, carried a lot more of the Trump speeches, so I listened to every one of them. It was a cynical and sick campaign, but it was, at least in his mind, about what he thought his base wanted. He thought they wanted a wall. He thought they wanted harsher immigration policies. This campaign is about his retribution against his perceived political enemies, about freeing his supporters who went to the Capitol and committed crimes at his direction that endangered the life of Mike Pence. And it's about taking and spending all of his donors' money on his legal fees whilst he possesses buildings and planes and whatnot. Do you think this is something that we'll hear more about in the coming months?
If you mean from the Biden campaign, Nicole, I wouldn't begin to guess. I imagine it would be a smart strategy to focus on the big ripoff claims of the January 6th committee and how, Chris Christie puts it better than others, that basically most donors in the middle class and the working class probably don't realize that all of their money is going to pay law firms and lawyers who are trying to delay Donald Trump from having to actually have a trial on any of the more serious indictments against him in federal court. I find one of the most interesting things, if you don't mind me diverging a little.
Please.
I find this trail of money, which a lot of us sort of took for granted, right, that he wasn't paying his legal bills, starting when Chris Christie spoke about it and before. But I find the detail and the precision so valuable because what you and I can see as we step back away from the chart is that during the time Donald Trump was trying to convince people to fund his election defense, which he never really intended to do, he was engaged in some of the criminal acts he is accused of by Jack Smith. It is in January and in late December that he is packing up boxes with his aides to take with him to Mar-a-Lago, recognizing, while he's telling his supporters something else, recognizing that he's going to have to leave the White House. He did not win the election. As well, he is actively engaged in trying to use every level of power in the White House and in the Oval to force the Department of Justice to tell people that there is fraud in this election, to force Mike Pence to refuse to certify the results of Biden's victory. Literally, while he is raising this money that will pay for his lawyers, he is engaged in the acts which Jack Smith says now was a criminal conspiracy of historic proportions.
It's so interesting. He's committing the crimes while he's raising the money to pay for the criminal defense lawyers who are now defending him and successfully, unfortunately, achieving some of these delays that are part of where the legal strategy meets up with the political strategy. I want to show our viewers some of what you're talking about. And this is it may be the only investigation into what you're talking about that is before the public, before they vote in November. This is the work of the January 6th Select Committee on this issue.
Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 a day. The emails claimed the, quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to, quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election, and encouraged them to, quote, fight back. But as the Select Committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false, yet they continued to barrage small-dollar donors with emails, encouraging them to donate to something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The Select Committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually a fund called the Election Defense Fund.
Is it fair to say that the Election Defense Fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic? Yes.
On November 9th, 2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials, $204,857 to the Trump Hotel Collection, and over $5 million to Event Strategies, Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6 rally on the Ellipse.
You know, Carol, the Dominion lawsuit and what became public facing made all of us into these dangerous armchair First Amendment legal scholars. So I'm going to ask a question admitting that I am not one. But we became familiar with this idea of known falsity and how that ties to more exposure around questions of fraud. And I wonder if you think this idea that they knowingly peddled a lie to raise money that they're now spending on their campaign is something where he remains vulnerable.
I think it's a legal area that for being a president who's working in the campaign finance field, I think that it would be a slam dunk. I'm not, again, nor am I, Nicole, a First Amendment lawyer, but I will say that I have seen politicians raise money saying that it's for their campaign, and then they're paying their babysitter and their consulting fees for something totally different that has very little to do with their campaign, and it has never come raining down upon them. You'll remember, of course, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's right-hand man, was indicted for fraudulently claiming to donors that he was raising money for this nonprofit that was going to build the rest of the wall, when actually he was paying himself and other members of that leadership team of that nonprofit that was not building a wall. And that fraud was part of what he was charged with and prosecuted for, and ultimately by Donald Trump pardoned for. I think it's a little different, actually, for a president and former president who's saying, I'm raising this money for this purpose. We will see, but I don't see the charges there yet.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.